Hello, everyone. I'm your co-host, Eric Swartz, Web3 tycoon and head of Web3 at Sterlington. Please join us in welcoming my close friend, Arca Senior Vice President Michal Benedykcinski.
Great pronunciation there, Eric. Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. Excited to join the show.
Very excited to have you on. I was a little nervous. I was going to ask you potentially, hey, how do I pronounce this? But I've been getting better. So we had my friend Luke on, whose name I still can't do. It's like Hatchadevich or something like that. So we've been just calling him Luke from now on. It's Luke from Bitco. He does capital intros. So yours is much easier than the Hatchadevich. So I mean, you've certainly made my job easy today, Michal, and as you always do with the deep, thoughtful regulatory analytics that drive some of your investment theses. We would love to kind of drill down more on and hear more about your experience prior to Arca, investment banks, Web3 projects, now Web3 investor. Tell us all about it.
Sure. So my road into the proverbial rabbit hole that everyone active in the space kind of finds himself getting pulled down really started in kind of the TradFi world. Started out in a pretty classical training field of kind of investment banking, corporate finance. Did most of the M&A advisory in the least sexy of the TMT verticals in kind of the telecoms. So a lot of like last mile utility, data centers, telco towers, a lot of kind of the hard infrastructure makes all of this right now, even coal, actually happen. In that regard, I did spend a lot of time, especially on the buy side, looking at data centers and doing quite a bit of bolt-on acquisitions, kind of portfolio roll-ups for a private equity fund out of Europe. And that was my probably first exposure, quite an unconventional one, to the world of crypto and the crypto economies that were emerging. Because of that background in data centers, I actually started freelancing circa 2016 when some of the data centers out in Scandinavia and Europe were looking to potentially converge into mining of Ethereum back then. So when it used to be proof of work. And yeah, I kind of helped them with some of the financial engineering, especially around the time of financing some of the equipment purchases, purchasing power agreements, negotiation of those, which is pretty common. And that was really the first semblance of my that there can be a very real economy running on these crypto rails, which to a TradFi person like myself, for the longest time was a little bit of a no-go, kind of dark corner of the internet that probably my compliance would yell a lot if we ever touch directly.
That makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense that you would see it in that space, especially given all the adoption that we're seeing within Africa and other developing countries that might have been super active while you were doing those private equity deals. Because I know they're having a very similar adoption curve as it related to mobile to Web3 now, which is really striking. And I would love to hear more about sort of your experience with that and how kind of seeing mobile proliferate is similar to what you're seeing now with Web3 or not.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think there's a lot of similarities we can kind of tease out from that framework, especially looking at the proliferation of kind of mobile users worldwide, but emerging market specific. In Europe, especially, I have seen for quite some time, honestly, the past 2 decades, of most of the telecom companies actually having a very significant financial arm to their operations. So beyond rendering you access to your mobile, 5G networks, you would also very quickly, with companies like Vodafone, T-Mobile, and others, do a lot more business via your subscription, whether it's pay utilities, whether it's essentially have your initial financial apps. Access to all those was rendered via the mobile, essentially extension of your life. That model has only proliferated and taken to a whole new level in the emerging markets. You're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the world, where mobile became the first delivery platform for these super apps. And super apps is probably the pitch that we're hearing a lot from a variety of different early stage ventures. But if I were to kind of name just one super app that truly deserves those stripes, you look at WeChat in China, that essentially became not only an aggregator and kind of very popular messengers for social forums, but very quickly became kind of the financial powerhouse of you being able to send quite literally money as a text message. And so that draws a lot of parallels with what crypto is trying to accomplish, where it's headed, and most importantly to us as we are kind of observing what's around the corner. One of the elements and one of my personal frustrations has been that crypto has not really truly lived up to its potential of bringing 10x type of payments experience to the masses. I think we are still kind of falling short there. And this is the element where this part of the cycle, I'm particularly excited to not only back founders working in this vertical, but I'm also finally seeing a convergence of the regulatory frameworks coming out, primarily out of Europe and UK, that are prioritizing regulations in and around stablecoins, and by adjacency, all of the payments frameworks that need to be set in order for those founders to be able to do and build legally with some good kind of guidance to boot.
Absolutely, man. And I couldn't agree more. I think as we get clearer and clearer instruction from the various global regulators, we'll see more and more adoption, especially in diasporic cultures that are using remittance markets significantly. And that's really a powerful tool to have that next step where we see this technology actually become the actual more powerful payments technology, as you indicate, and as you noted correctly, that we still haven't really seen, and the promise is only a future one still to this day. So I too am equally excited about that future occurrence, and I think we're closer than ever. So I couldn't be more excited, actually, and I'm glad you brought it up. And not surprised at all, investments like Bitwave, CoinRoutes, and YGG, you guys are doing incredible. Tell us about Arca.
For sure. So super excited to share kind of with your audience the level of activities that we have going on at Arca. I think to most, at least active in the space, we are primarily known by our flagship digital asset fund, which is a liquid vehicle that is primarily targeting the liquid tokens, so some of the most liquid out there, and essentially kind of positioning accordingly according to several different themes that we find particularly interesting. But one that also in the very early days of Arca back in 2018 gave us exposure to some of the early primitives that were starting to take hold. So one of those first primitives back then was still called Open Finance, where we have backed projects by Rob Leshner and Compound, Stan Yadava, and became one of the first institutionally inclined desks that was actively participating in the summer of DeFi. That was probably one of the first unlock functions for us that made us realize kind of the power of this technology and these open networks to redefine a lot of very traditional financial mechanisms that most of our team knows from kind of their TradFi days. So lending and borrowing, money markets funds, and kind of all the potential kind of expansions of more traditional financial instruments that we kind of grew up with in the early days of our careers. Eventually, Arca has grown to also encompass two private markets funds, and one of which I'm particularly involved in day-to-day of, which is our dedicated venture fund, where we look at some of the earliest stage opportunities, primarily in a pre-seed, seed, and up to Series A, spanning really the gamut of, as you kind of alluded to, some of these Web 2.5 operators that allow for good way to bridge a lot of traditional industries, bring them on chain, and give them a path to utilize these public networks in kind of the most beneficial ways. We also back companies that are pursuing a more traditional software as a service playbook, but in a crypto context. And here they're either rendering tax advice, like in the case of Bitwave, or security and simulation audits for a lot of kind of the smart contract developers and early stage teams out there. And probably the third bucket of interest to us, and one that has been picking up steam, and especially in this day and age where everyone is obsessed about AI and the crossover to crypto, for us, it's really just a subsegment of data. And this has been one of probably the biggest buckets of our investing activity, on-chain data analytics, primarily because we are some of the big power users of the tooling that's out there on our institutional side. But also we love to see kind of where this is taking us next from kind of that on-chain analytics perspective. And in the vision that was started by the founders here at Arca of having much more efficient future-proof capital markets, those pieces of the puzzle will certainly play a role. And then finally, it is important to also mention, Arca also has a lab adjacent to it. So this is one of our particular strategies to work and build financial products and bring them to the public, particularly taking on some of the more traditional financial instruments and see how we can run them on these public networks and do it in a compliant manner, which is important with especially kind of the institutional clientele that we're servicing.
Absolutely, man. And I mean, being as close to builders as you guys are, would love to hear kind of what you've learned, what you envision the future of Web3 looking like, and what you think people should be building.
Sure. I think there are a couple of categories. One that we kind of touched at the outset, which is certainly kind of payments on and off ramps, and all of kind of the broadly understood ecosystem of getting fiat into crypto and vice versa. I think, which is very unfortunate, with the last 6 months, we have seen a major pullback from many of our peers in the investing space, especially on the venture side, from that as kind of the nexus of a category that we think is absolutely critical for this economy to grow. That pullback has been primarily dictated by what we have seen coming out of regulatory regime here stateside, where any form of fiat finding its way onto the rails comes under incredible scrutiny and potential ostracizing outlook from kind of the regulatory bodies, and kind of the alphabet soup of agencies that would start getting involved here only seems to be growing larger by the day, by the month, by week of the announcements coming out of DC. Now, where we have seen some of the opportunities that get us super excited within this vertical, they have actually come out of overseas. And so here we're spending both time in Brazil, out of kind of Latin markets. One of the areas that we have identified as particularly promising, from not only the central bank being one of the best in class innovators. When you look at central banks out in the world, they were the first ones to essentially come up with a framework of PIX, that's PIX, which is this instantaneous payment system that is, believe it or not, anchored in and around the central bank, which is super great and allows for new design paths from kind of the founders that we're talking to on the ground. And the other one that we are certainly canvassing and backing founders is in Europe and UK. There we are seeing not only kind of the extension of the fintech revolution that took hold the last decade now extend to crypto, but with also the frameworks such as Europeans MiCA and the recently proposed FCA bill. We are very encouraged by the fact that there is a laser focus now from the regulators ahead of the election to zero in on stablecoins and unlock the stablecoins and some of the new potential payment methods arising there. So within that vein of payments, beyond kind of on and off ramps and some of the service providers that we like to back, of course, there's a piece of the compliance. Some big businesses have been built in the past, primarily around kind of the monitoring, transaction monitoring, and KYC and AML. Now we're seeing kind of the evolution of that model, where some of these offerings are also trying to cover decentralized finance. And so new innovative ways to determine, know your pool. If you're an institutional desk want to participate in lending protocol, how do you know that some of the portion of the funds that's tied up in a given liquidity pool is not coming from kind of illicit sources, and hence would trigger some very serious ramifications from a regulatory perspective. So we are excited to see more of innovation in that vertical, and talking to a lot of founders trying to do that. And then finally, let's not forget probably one of the elements that is very important to note is how does crypto get this kind of net new wave of a user. And here we are trying to look at some of the potential promises of sectors like gaming, which has been historically quite an important segment to Arca. Having seeded Sky Mavis before they launched Axie Infinity, we kind of had the front seat of what that very early adoption pattern could look like. And so we certainly are very much on the lookout for some of the tooling that enables that kind of next generation of a user that maybe is not a Web3 native come on chain. And that's probably another area where we're continuously scouting.
Yeah, man, that's incredible. I mean, to unpack that a little bit, I think one of the areas that is most interesting today is like, and I'm just wondering, because I know that the thesis had been previously for folks, and a lot of people, not just Arca, but many were in pursuing investment opportunities offshore, just generally because, and not meaning within like tax haven jurisdictions, like within true traditional securities law regimes with complex regulatory environments. And obviously that was related to the fact that regulatory regimes were being adopted in those places. And now obviously with Ripple, we have a situation where the courts have kind of come out and said that it is at least possible to create a non-security crypto asset, which is pretty interesting stuff. It's new. There's certainly time for us to see how this all plays out, but would love to hear your thoughts on whether that changes your mind at all about the US ecosystem and the investment opportunities here, and whether you think that there will be more investment activity in the US following the Ripple case.
A lot to unpack there. So first off, as the Arca, we do actually differ from many of our compatriots in kind of the investment landscape, as in we actually carry two RIA licenses that tie us kind of directly into kind of the reporting scheme with SEC. And so with that in mind, we do particularly tread extremely carefully when it comes to any of the kind of onshore, offshore activities of our fund, our associated funds, and type of kind of positions that we take on. With that in mind, I think we on the venture side are probably have a lot more flexibility in terms of the mandate when it comes to seeding some of the earliest stage projects. And with that comes also big responsibility of trying to guide them towards some of the potentially promising areas to explore and parts of the market that maybe are underserved given kind of the regulatory makeup today. So from kind of just a really top-down view, on the first premise, the area that still is quite actively as far as the deal making goes on the venture side is a lot of the middleware. So anything that does not touch necessarily kind of the fiat or crypto rails, but rather is rendering some sort of service or providing technology rails, is still rather safe. And I think it is also safe to say that this is US, particularly the market where most of the talent resides, and that is undeniable. Some of the talent that is now kind of edging closer to those fiat and crypto rails might be fleeing or might be essentially taking a very calculated risk to pursue other jurisdictions and go to places where A, you might actually get some form of a legible framework for your activities going forward. But two, you might actually have a very real engagement with the regulatory bodies and provide input of what that framework should look like. I think founders, goes without saying, especially stateside, have really no illusion as to what the open door policy under Gensler's SEC look like. And there is a markedly very different experience with the founders that we talk to in Europe as well as UK, where that engagement looks entirely different. And so you actually are seeing the first fruits of that labor in frameworks like MiCA, like the bill that I've already mentioned in the UK. And so with that in mind, our investment mandate has not really changed. What has changed and what is evolving are some of the potentially areas where founders decide to kind of laser focus on. And so while middleware potentially becomes a strong category, still here stateside, for a lot of that kind of innovation on the edges of getting fiat to crypto and vice versa, a lot more activity, and I would say a lot more nuances right now tested out in the wild in some of those markets where it is actually kosher to do. And so that's perhaps why we're spending a little bit more time, why myself and my partner David, this second half of the year have been primarily in Europe, meeting there with the regulators, meeting with the founders, with essentially the stakeholders of this new regime that's emerging there. And I'm also being very realistic. I don't want to kind of bash US for essentially being so behind. I do think that especially with the makeup of the decision-making in Europe, the upcoming elections across Europe and UK, some of those bills actually promulgation into a law, binding law, will take time. But at least, you know, the kind of first shots were fired, and I think everyone is watching, and we are certainly seeing this from the talent pipeline gravitating and moving towards the places where they might be just a lot more welcome.
I was super glad to have you mention it, and the reason why I wanted to cover it was because I think it's just such an incredibly important topic. I think people aren't necessarily aware of the amount that these regulatory decisions affect how people are incentivized to build these new innovative technologies and where they're willing to do so. So I really appreciate the insight that you guys bring. I think it's unique, and I think it's very on point. And I think regulators and policymakers need to hear these things from the business folk within the space, like Arca, who are looking at things very closely and seeing founders really make those decisions in the real world and in real time. So if that doesn't contribute to a real awakening in our lawmakers, then I don't know what will. And I really appreciate you taking the time to inform them, Michal. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think there are very real human stories that ought to be heard and amplified. We know of, in fact, several startups that have been really working on the bleeding edge of what the decentralized finance of kind of that next generation could look like, that ended up closing shop and returning funds to the investors because primarily of some of the very punitive potentially actions that they would face by essentially going on into mainnet. Now, some other founders decided to kind of go and still proceed, awaiting at kind of the uncertainty. But again, to kind of your point, the capital very much flows based on some of the whims coming both out of DC, Brussels, London, and many other jurisdictions, reaching all the way to kind of Hong Kong and Singapore as well, which is almost a separate topic altogether, given kind of the world of two speeds that we are living in crypto.
Absolutely, man. And with that, thank you so much for coming on, Mal. Web3, we hope you'll join us next week to continue our journey unraveling the mysteries and exploring the limitless possibilities of the new internet.